In 2 minutes throughout Boulder County, there's going to be this moment of silence. And I'm very keenly aware of this idea that there's a lot of hurt going on, because that moment of silence is going to be remembering folks who have lost their lives to COVID-19, who have been stricken with this virus. And of course, there are so many that are in harm's way: healthcare workers, emergency responders, folks in hospitals and physicians. All of them are putting themselves in harm's way. And then there are others who are just trying to take care of ourselves and somehow are being struck by this virus. And it is so contagious. Who would have thought that picking up garbage and working in other kinds of places, folks that usually are under the radar, now we're celebrating and are expressing gratitude, whether it's in a grocery store or somebody else along the way. There is this incredible amount of risk just from going outside. And it's been really puzzling to me, because it looks so calm outside in so many ways, especially with less traffic, especially with less congestion. And yet there's a part of me that feels like this is going to be the closest thing I experienced like a war in my lifetime. And that's really how I'm encountering this. So I'm trying to figure out with you for tonight, how does Judaism acknowledge this? How does Judaism recognize what we're supposed to do in the midst of a pandemic? How do we figure out how to respond? So I realized something, that in Jewish tradition, we are totally fixated on these ideas of Jewish law. We are focused deeply on rules and rituals and how to actually do things. Well, Jewish law is a very rich and full spectrum of ideas. There's a written Torah, which we will refer to as the Bible. There's an oral Torah that is referred to as the Talmud. And they have tremendous resources, not all of which is going to be about law or rules, but a lot of it is. And all throughout Jewish history, there are tremendous treasures of rabbinic literature that talks about law. Even today, even our Reform movement has something called Responsa, where we talk about Jewish legal traditions and how we should behave in the world. And that's what I think is really important for us now at this moment in the midst of a pandemic. Our Torah, thinking about it as widely as possible, is about how we behave. It's interesting that it doesn't talk about rights. In the entire Torah, there's nothing that refers to our inalienable human rights. We infer these rights because of our interpretations. But in the ancient world, there's no concept of rights. We are to be dutiful to God. We are to follow God's laws. And what are those laws? Mostly relating to conduct and generosity. It deals with learning and teaching, and it deals with worship. But ancient systems didn't have a concept of rights, something that you were entitled to. What we do have is a system of duties. We can infer that there are property rights, for example, based on commandments like you shall not steal in Exodus in chapter 20, or you can't move your neighbor's landmark and change where your property begins and ends. That's in the book of Deuteronomy. And when we see lost property or a lost animal, we are compelled by the Torah to return that lost property. So we can develop an idea of property rights, but it doesn't talk about rights in the text. We interpret these commandments together to develop values and ethics. And that's where we develop our idea of rights from. But in the tradition itself, it's not there. So again, what is there? What is there in this Jewish tradition? Responsibilities. God is giving us responsibilities, those duties. Those responsibilities focus on the fact that God believes that people are entitled to certain types of treatment, not of rights. For the modern, it's our rights or maybe our privileges or even our benefits that we feel like we are entitled to, or a declaration of human rights from the United Nations that will acknowledge that everybody is entitled to things. But in the Torah, for God, it is because everybody is created in God's image. It is because every single human being, without exception, has value and worth and need to be treated with dignity. And because human beings have legally recognized needs, both of those. You're created in God's image and you have needs, not always wants, but needs. A Supreme Court justice in the state of Israel, his name is Chaim Cohen. He wrote years ago, it stands to reason that from the duty to assist and maintain the poor, a fundamental human right of every human being to his livelihood may reasonably be inferred, as the fundamental right to life may justifiably be inferred from the prohibition of homicide. By performing a duty, you are doing the will of God, and hence an act of worship and service. Another Jewish scholar, he died some years ago, but he was a professor of law at Cornell University. His name is Milton Konvitz. And Konvitz said, people conform faith to their own image, to make it serve their own interests. This would be nothing short of idol making and idolatry. Precisely the opposite is involved in Judaism. In Judaism, there is constant study, examination, and re-examination of beliefs, values, historical events, narratives, myths, parables, proverbs, prophecy, and poetry, so that there may be no idols and no idolatries. The only real, the only radical heresy is fundamentalism, literalism, he says, the belief that there is no room for interpretation. The Torah system of making us responsible for one another, obligated to care for the poor in response to the needs of the vulnerable, is a meaningful way to actualize our modern concept of rights. But we can all talk about rights and pervert them. If someone has a right to eat, that doesn't always mean that folks are going to help make sure they have enough food. If we have the responsibility to feed someone or respond to the vulnerable, then we are directly responsible for each other's needs. And it's this idea of rights and responsibilities that I'm wrestling with today, because outside, and I look on the news, whether it's in our capital in Denver or someplace else around the country, I'm troubled by those who say they have this right, an unalienable right to open restaurants, that's a right. People are hurting and they're scared for their livelihoods, and I get that. And there's a need that they have. And we have to respond to people who are vulnerable, no matter who they are. But there's also a difference when we assert that we have rights based on false claims and dangerous demands of those who are endangering their own health and the health of others by gathering to protest public health measures. I don't understand. I can't really gather. And I'm frustrated because it's about what rights do we have? I remember when I was still a rabbi in the state of Georgia, and there was a whole conversation about gun violence prevention laws, gun control, and protections of the Second Amendment. And there were people who got up in front of the House committee and said that they have a God-given right to keep these weapons. And I'm not so sure that that is true. We do have an obligation to respond. We do have an obligation to protect. We do have an obligation to make sure that people are fed. But what is this sense of rights in Judaism? I think it's a little misunderstood. We have responsibilities. We have to act. So no matter who is vulnerable, if their shops are closed, we have a responsibility to take care of each other. But I'm also going to say we have a responsibility as best as we possibly can to stay home. Who would have ever thought that we can say that our responsibility is to go out less and less? People are asking, when are churches and synagogues and temples and mosques, when are we going to organize and open again? Because we have to be together. And I'm going to say our most significant doctrine is pikuach nefesh, that we can break any laws necessary in order to protect human life. Break laws of Shabbat, break laws in business, whatever it might be. Our job is to protect lives, even if it makes us uncomfortable. So this pikuach nefesh idea, this doctrine of being permitted to break laws in order to save human life is paramount. Human life is doing whatever we can, whatever is necessary to save lives. So again, there's a question, especially as these young people are going to be moving forward into an idea of how are they going to live? How are you going to live? What are our responsibilities for one another? From a Jewish point of view, what are our responsibilities for each other in this congregation, for the people in our county? What are our responsibilities for the people that are feeling hurt? How do we show up? Because if we don't, not only will people remain hurt and remain in pain and feel abandoned and left out, how do we respond with responsibility, not just talk, but with actions? In Deuteronomy, it says very clearly that there's not going to be any poverty anywhere among us. And then it also says, just a few verses away, that it's our job to feed the hungry. It's not a contradiction. It is our responsibility to step forward and do that is going to alleviate hunger in our midst. And how do we alleviate a virus? I don't have an answer for that. I'm waiting for the day, God willing, speedily and soon, there's going to be a vaccine and there's going to be appropriate protocols that we can return to life as we know it. But for now, from a Jewish point of view, it's not really about our rights to do what we want. It is our responsibility to take care of our neighbors, particularly those that are most vulnerable. That's why the synagogue is not closed, but our facility is. Our congregation is moving, but the facility is not going to be bringing us back together anytime soon. We can't be gathering and putting people at risk, because then we put the synagogue as a place of idolatry. And that's not God wants. That's not what God wants. I don't know exactly what God wants. I'm just another guy. But I know that our God, every person's God, the one God of all creation, wants you to stay safe, to take care of yourselves, to be responsible for others, not just to care without the action, but to do and to help and to move. So, friends, it's 7:13. That moment of silence around Boulder around the state was moments ago. You were silent, I kept talking because that's what rabbis do, but we join everybody in the state, everybody in this country, and everybody in this world with prayers for healing, for strength to our mourners, to people who have lost. Strength for ourselves to have the courage of our convictions and to make a difference in the lives of another people. Ken Yehi Ratzon. I do believe that is God's will. We are here to express it. Let's take a breath. Let's move to our conclusion. We're going to move